Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in several weeks, the Senate will begin its deliberations on the fiscal year 2008 budget resolution. It is my strong belief that the Senate must pass a budget that will expand the shrinking middle class, that will reduce the enormous and growing gap between the wealthy and the poor, that will keep our promises to our nation's veterans, that will reduce our record-breaking national debt, and that will lower the poverty rate. That is what this United States Senate should be focusing on. Simply stated, in my opinion, the way for us to move in that direction is to repeal the president's tax breaks that have been given to the wealthiest 1%, the people who need it the least. And in addition, for us to take a hard look at the Pentagon, to take a hard look at the waste and the fraud and the unnecessary weapon systems that are existing in the Pentagon right now. We don't need weapon systems that were designed to fight the Soviet Union. We need an approach to fight al-Qaeda. And I think we could find many billions of dollars in savings when we take a hard look at the military budget as well. The bill that I am introducing today, the National Priorities Act, will in fact accomplish these goals. A budget is more than just a long list of numbers. A budget is a statement about our values, our priorities, and the time is long overdue for the United States Congress to get its priorities right, to begin to stand up for the middle class and working families of this country, rather than multinational corporations and the wealthiest people who year after year after year have so much power over this institution. Madam President.
Galleries, please refrain from expressing any opinion as much as I know you want to.
Madam President, let me do what is too rarely done on the floor of this Senate and take a hard and cold look at the reality facing the American middle class and working families of this country. As a member of the Budget Committee, every week we have somebody from the President's administration coming before us, and they tell us the economy is doing really great. It is marvelous. The people of Vermont and the middle class of this country don't believe it, because every single day they are seeing an economy which is forcing them in many instances to work longer hours for lower wages. An economy in which they wonder how their kids are going to get decent paying jobs. An economy which suggests that for the first time in the modern history of our country, our children, if we do not change our direction, could have a lower standard of living than we do. What the American dream has been about is that our parents work hard so that we could have a better life than they do. And that's what we want for our kids. But unless we make fundamental changes in the way this economy is working, the likelihood is that our kids, despite a huge increase in worker productivity, despite technology, will have a lower standard of living than we do, and we must not allow that to happen. Madam President, since President Bush has been in office, more than 5 million Americans have slipped into poverty. We are seeing an increase in the rate of poverty in the United States, including 1 million more children. Not only does the United States have the highest rate of poverty of any major country on earth, we also shamefully have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. You know, I know that there's a whole lot of talk about moral values on the floor of the Senate and on the floor of the House. To my mind, having the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world is not a moral value. It is a disgrace. It is a shame. It is time that we paid attention to the children of this country rather than the wealthiest people in this country. Madam President, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the childhood poverty rate is nearly 18%. Other studies suggest that it might be higher. Now, some people say, well, that's the way it goes. Well, that is not the way it goes among our other major countries in the world. In Germany, childhood poverty rate is 9%. In France, it's less than 8%. In Sweden, it's less than 7%. In Norway, 4.2%. In Finland, 3.4%. Madam President, if other countries can have childhood poverty rates of less than 5%, so can the United States of America. Just one example, our allies in Great Britain made a commitment to end childhood poverty in their country, and they have reduced the childhood poverty rate by over 20% since 1999. At the same time, child poverty in the United States increased by 12%. If we make the commitment, we can do that. Madam President, let's take a look at our health care situation. Cost of health care, as everybody in this country knows, are soaring. The number of people without health insurance have risen to a record high of 46.4 million in the year 2005. That is an increase of almost 7 million more Americans lacking health insurance since President Bush took office. While the president continues to cut taxes for millionaires and billionaires, the lack of health insurance kills many more Americans each year than September 11 and Katrina combined did. In fact, the National Academy of Science estimates that 18,000 Americans die each year because they lack health insurance. Madam President, in my view, the United States of America must join the rest of the industrialized world. We must guarantee health care to all of our people as a right of citizenship. And while I know some people say we can't afford to do it, I would argue that at a time when we are spending more than twice as much per capita on health care as any major nation on earth, we can do that. We can provide quality health care to every man, woman, and child as a right of citizenship without spending a nickel more than we are presently spending. But to do that, we must be honest. We're going to have to take on the insurance companies. We're going to have to take on the drug companies. We're going to have to take on the multinational corporations that benefit out of our health care system and say that when we spend money for health care, it should go to health care, not for profiteering. Madam President, health care is not just a human rights issue. It is not just a moral issue. It is an economic issue as well. Small businesses cannot survive if they are forced to pay huge increases in health care premiums each and every year. That is true in the state of Vermont. That is true all over America. More and more small businesses are simply saying, we can't do it. We can't provide health insurance to our workers, which is one of the reasons that the number of uninsured is going up. Madam President, in addition to the health care crisis, there is an area within health care that I want to focus a lot of attention on in the Senate, and that is the crisis in dental care. In rural America, in rural Vermont, it is becoming very, very difficult for people to find a dentist. The Surgeon General has reported that tooth decay has become the single most common chronic childhood disease, 5 times more common than asthma and 7 times more common than hay fever. And I would hope and will be introducing legislation to address the dental crisis in this country. I do not want to see kids in schools have teeth rotting in their mouths. We can do better than that. In terms of education, Madam President, millions of middle-class American families are finding it increasingly difficult to afford the escalating cost of a college education, with average tuition and other costs increasing by more than $4,300 at a 4-year public university and over $8,000 at a 4-year private college since 2001. We all understand that young people are not going to make it into the middle class unless they get a college education. We all understand that our nation is not going to be economically competitive if our young people do not get the best college educations that they possibly can be. And yet all over our country, middle-class families are saying, how am I going to be able to afford to send my kids to college? And young people are graduating college on average about $20,000 in debt. If they're lower income, they may come out of college $30,000, $40,000 in debt. If we are serious in what we say about the importance of education, we have got to make college education affordable to every family in this country. We don't want to lose the intellectual capital of millions of young people who are sitting there wondering, can I afford to go to college? Do I want to come out of college deeply in debt? Madam President, last year, 35 million Americans in our country, the richest country in the history of the world, struggled to put food on the table. Struggled to put food on the table. The Agricultural Department recently reported that the number of the poorest, hungriest Americans keeps going up. Now, what is going on in this great country when more and more of our fellow Americans are going hungry and are struggling to put food on the table? This should not be happening in America. But it's not only hunger. We have an affordable crisis in housing as well. Today, millions of working Americans are paying 50 to 60% of their limited incomes to put a roof over their heads, and we have families in the United States of America, families who are sleeping in their cars, children who are sleeping in their cars, and we have people, as we all know, who continue to sleep out on the streets of cities and towns all over America. Last year, there were 1.2 million home foreclosures in this country, an increase of 42% since 2005. Madam President, when we talk about the needs of the middle class, it's not just affordable housing. The issue of energy is a prominent issue that must be addressed. The cost of energy has risen rapidly since President Bush has been in office. Oil prices have more than doubled, and gasoline prices have gone up by 70% since January of 2001, and gas prices are soaring as we speak right now. And in rural states like my state of Vermont, like Minnesota, workers get into the car, they fill up their gas tank, and suddenly they're finding that that increased cost is coming right out of their paycheck. They're not making much more money. Cost of gas is going up. In America today, bottom line is that millions of American workers are working longer hours for lower wages, and median income for working-age families has declined for 5 years in a row. Husbands are working long hours. Wives are working long hours. Kids in high school are working, trying to make ends meet, and in many instances, people are falling further and further behind. Today, incredible as it may sound, the personal savings rate in America is below zero, and that has not happened since the Great Depression of the 1930s. In other words, all over this country, working people and people in the middle class are purchasing groceries and other basic necessities with their credit cards, and are going, in the process, deeper and deeper in debt. Over the past 6 years, when we talk about the economy and decent paying jobs, we should recognize that as a nation, we have lost 3 million manufacturing jobs, which often pay people good wages and good benefits. In my own small state of Vermont, we have lost 10,000 jobs, manufacturing jobs, in the last 6 years, which is 20% of the manufacturing jobs in our small state. And the reality is that if somebody loses their manufacturing job and they're lucky enough to find another job, in most cases that other job will pay substantially lower wages and have worse benefits than the manufacturing job that they have lost. Today, 3 million fewer American workers have pension coverage than when President Bush took office, and half of private sector American workers have no pension coverage whatsoever. And I have long been involved in the struggle to make sure that workers are able to retain the pensions that were promised to them by their workers. But we're seeing more and more workers who have enormous pension anxiety. Is the pension that was promised to me 20 years ago when I began to work in this company going to be there when I need it when I retire? And more workers are finding that that will not be the case. And one point that we often do not talk about, Madam President, is just how hard the people in our country are working. We kind of forget about that. But the fact of the matter is that the people, working people in this country, now work the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world. In my state of Vermont, it is absolutely not uncommon to see people who are working not one job, not two jobs, but on occasion working 3 jobs, trying to cobble together an income, trying to cobble together some health care for their families. People are working 50 hours, 60 hours, 70 hours. New York Times reported a while back that the idea of the 2-week paid vacation is becoming something of history. So we have people who are working 51 weeks a year. There are people who are working 52 weeks a year. That is what is going on in the middle class and working families of our country. Now, Madam President, the reason that I raise these issues is that it is terribly important to bring a dose of reality onto the floor of the Senate. When the President tells us the economy is doing great, the truth of the matter is he's right in one sense. The economy is not doing well for the middle class. It is not doing well for working families. Poverty is increasing. But the President is right when he says the economy is doing well for the wealthiest people in this country. That's true. Rich are getting richer, middle class is shrinking, poverty is increasing. That is the reality. The reality is that the upper 1% of the families in America today, that 1% has not had it so good since the 1920s. According to Forbes magazine, the collective net worth of the wealthiest 400 Americans increased by $120 billion last year to $1.25 trillion. 400 wealthiest Americans are worth $1.25 trillion. Sadly, Madam President, the United States today has, and I know we don't talk about this too much, but it's important to bring it out on the table. The United States today has, by far, the most unequal distribution of wealth of any major country on earth and the most unequal distribution of income of any major country on earth. And that gap between the rich and everybody else is growing wider. Today, the wealthiest 13,000 families in America earn nearly as much income as the bottom 20 million, and the wealthiest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. 13,000 families earning almost as much income as the bottom 20 million, richest 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. Madam President, that trend is very dangerous for our country. It suggests that we are moving in the direction of oligarchy, where a small number of people have incredible wealth, and with that wealth, incredible power, at the same time as the vast majority of our people are struggling just to keep their heads above water. We as a nation can do a lot better than that. Madam President, according to a December 2006 report by the Congressional Budget Office, the average after-tax income of the wealthiest 1% of households rose from $722,000 in 2003 to $868,000 in 2004, after adjusting for inflation, a one-year increase of nearly $146,000, or 20%. This represents the largest increase in 15 years, measured both in percentage terms and in real dollars. Now, what does that mean in English? What it means in English is that the wealthiest people in this country are doing phenomenally well. That's what it means. While a lot of other people are struggling very hard to keep their families afloat. Now, Madam President, why have I given this overview of the state of the economy? I've given this overview because I think we need a budget that begins to address the realities that I have just discussed. We need a budget that says to the middle class and working families and low-income Americans, we know that you are hurting. We are on your side. And at the same time, we need a budget that says to the very wealthiest people in this country, you know what? You're part of America, too. Your incomes are soaring. If you're a CEO of a large corporation, you're making 400 times what the worker in your company is making. And you know what? We want you to be part of America, and you've got to make some sacrifices so the people in this country don't go hungry, so the working class kids can get a college education. Join America. Don't be separate with your huge incomes. The President has just, as you know, introduced his budget. And he has told us that in his budget, the United States does not have enough money to meet the health care needs of this country. And his response is to inadequately fund the Children's Health Insurance Program and to cut Medicare and Medicaid by $280 billion over the next decade. The President has told us we don't have enough money to take care of our veterans. And we all have seen recently what was going on in Walter Reed Hospital. And the President has said that despite the fact we have 22,000 wounded in Iraq, we have veterans on waiting lists all over this country, we just don't have the money to take care of our veterans. The President has told us we don't have enough money for child care. We don't have enough money for dental care. We don't have enough money for special education. We don't have enough money to address the crisis in global warming. We don't have enough money to make sure that qualified students have access to a quality education without going deeply into debt. The President has told us we don't have enough money to fully fund Head Start. We don't have enough money to expand the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's what the President has told us. But the President, in his budget, has also told us something else. The President has said that we don't have enough money for the needs of the middle class and working families. We do have enough money to provide $70 billion in tax cuts for the wealthiest 1%, and that we really don't have to take a hard look at the Pentagon and all of the waste, the fraud, the unnecessary weapon systems that are in that institution. Madam President, in my view, these upside-down priorities have got to be changed, and that is the responsibility of this Senate. And the bill that I am introducing today will begin to turn our national priorities in a very, very different direction than from what the President is suggesting. The National Priorities Act will repeal tax breaks for the wealthiest 1% in 2008 and eliminate $60 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon and use that money to do the following. In other words, what we are doing is going to ask our wealthy friends who have received huge tax breaks to start paying a little bit more in taxes. We're going to ask the Pentagon to take a hard look at their huge budget and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. We're going to be raising about $130 billion to do that. And now let me tell you what we can do with that $130 billion. We can provide health care services for over 4 million Americans by increasing investments in federally qualified health centers and by raising funds substantially for the National Health Service Corps. In my state and all over America, federally qualified health centers are providing cost-effective, quality health care to millions of people by increasing funding and expanding these programs, putting more money into these programs. We can provide high-quality health care, dental care, mental health counseling, low-cost prescription drugs. We can do it in a cost-effective way. We can make a serious effort to provide primary health care to every man, woman, and child in this country. That's what we can do. We can expand dental care access by providing $140 million more for workforce capital and equipment needed. We can address in a significant way the dental care crisis in this country. We can provide health care, health insurance to over 8 million children who are not covered by expanding the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program, by $15 billion. In my state of Vermont, almost all of our kids have health insurance. The rest of the country should move in that direction. It is not acceptable that children in America not have health insurance. We can do that through this legislation. Madam President, we can address the crisis in terms of inadequate funding in the VA and make sure that all of our veterans get the health care they were promised, the health care that they deserve. That's what this budget does. We also, in this budget, ensure that working families with children have access to affordable child care by increasing investments in the Child Care Development Block Grant by over $2 billion. It is a national outrage that all over this country, working families cannot find good quality, affordable child care. Single moms are going off to work and they worry. They worry deeply about the quality of care that their children are receiving. It is a major crisis. This legislation provides the funds to address that crisis. Head Start has been a successful program. This legislation provides the funding to allow every qualified child in America to receive early education, nutrition, and health services by fully funding the Head Start program. In my state of Vermont, and again, all over this country, higher and higher property taxes are causing very serious problems for middle-class families, splitting communities apart. This legislation will lower property taxes by keeping the federal commitment to provide 40% of the cost of special education costs for about 7 million children with disabilities. Mainstreaming kids with disabilities is a good idea. It's the right thing to do. Federal government has not kept the promises that it has made to school districts all over this country. We have got to increase funding substantially for special ed, not, as the president wants, cut funding for special ed. This bill does that. This bill provides an additional 330,000 students with Pell Grants and increases its purchasing power for over 5.4 million other students by doubling the maximum Pell Grant. In other words, we want our young people to be able to go to college. We want them not to come out in debt. This legislation does that. This legislation instills low-income high school students with the skills and opportunity they need to go to college by increasing the TRIO and Gear Up education programs by 50%. This legislation creates more than 200,000 jobs by increasing investments in renewable energy, energy-efficient appliances, public transportation, and high-speed rail. By making our environment cleaner, by attacking global warming or reversing global warming, we can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's what this legislation does. This legislation addresses the crisis in affordable housing by creating 180,000 jobs in constructing, preserving, and rehabilitating affordable housing rental units. This legislation reduces taxes between $400 to $1,134 per year for 10 million American workers and families with children by expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. This legislation reduces the deficit by $30 billion. Madam President, to be very honest with you, I do not expect this legislation to be passed tomorrow, probably not even the next day. But what this legislation is doing is providing this Senate and this Congress with a blueprint, and it's a very simple blueprint. It says, which side are you on? It says that when those people who come before us and says, yes, we understand that there's a health care crisis, we just can't afford to do anything about it. We understand that there's a child care crisis, there's a housing crisis, there's a crisis in terms of the affordability of higher education, but we can't do anything about it. We just don't have the money. What this legislation does is say, yes, we do have the money. We do have the money. If we rescind the tax breaks that go to millionaires and billionaires, If we ask the Pentagon to preserve, to make sure that we continue to have all of the resources that we need for our soldiers and the strongest military in the world, but take a hard look at waste, fraud, abuse, and weapon systems that we don't need. If you do those two things, we can come up with $130 billion. Without $130 billion, we can address the major problems facing our country, and we can lower our deficit. Madam President, I hope that my fellow colleagues will give serious thought to this legislation and that we can move it forward. Thank you very much.